So welcome. For the next 25 to 30 minutes, I'll be talking about global consent management. My name is Mikkel. I am a solutions consultant here at Atcore, and I've been working quite intensely the last year with consent management. So for the next 25 to 30 minutes, I'll be going through the following topics. First of all, I'm going to establish the difference between marketing consent and GDPR consent. Then I'll dive into and give you an introduction to the levels of complexities when working with marketing consent. Next, I'm going to give you some inspiration on how to handle the legal process around setting up your consent management. And lastly, I will give you some ideas on how to design your blueprint. And I will wrap up the webinar with a Q&A session. We are not that many people, so let's see how many questions there will be. The reason why I want to talk about GDPR consent in consent management in general is because in some of our consent management projects and daily work with our clients, we tend to come across confusion regarding marketing consent and GDPR consent and the difference between the two. So this is why I would like to start out by clarifying the difference. So first of all, we have the GDPR consent, and the GDPR consent can be summed up as the permission to store and process personal information. So every single EU person or lead in your database should have a GDPR consent as long as you're storing the data. And then there is the marketing consent, and that is basically the permission to contact an individual through one or more marketing channels. This means that the GDPR consent is actually a prerequisite for obtaining and using a marketing consent. If you don't have a GDPR consent, then you are not allowed to store the person's data. And if you're not allowed to store the person's data, you are definitely not allowed to contact them. So make sure that you obtain a GDPR consent at the same time you obtain a marketing consent. And if you are in doubt if your database is GDPR compliant, I have made a checklist with some questions that you can ask yourself. So first of all, do you have the necessary fields? So we recommend using 4 fields. 1 field for storing if the person has accepted the GDPR consent or not. Then a field for storing when they accepted the GDPR consent, the text they accepted, and the source of the GDPR consent. So was it a form or was it something else? If you can say yes, you have the fields, then you need to check if you are actively using them. So do you have the automation rules in place that automatically future-proofs your database and store the necessary data when a person submits the GDPR consent? And lastly, do you have valid data on all the fields and all the people in your database? If you can say yes to these 3 questions, you are most likely compliant. But if you can say no to any of them, your database is not compliant. Now I have established the difference between marketing consent and GDPR consent, and I would like to introduce you to the different levels of complexity when it comes to consent management. And for the rest of the presentation, I will not be talking about GDPR consent anymore. It will be strictly revolving around marketing consent. So I will be presenting 4 scenarios with varying degrees of consent complexity, and one of them should probably represent your company's situation. So the first scenario is where let's just take Atcore, the company I work in, as an example. So in this example, Atcore is only operating in one country using a single marketing channel, which is email. This is the simplest form of consent management. And in this example, I'm displaying a checkbox with an accompanying consent text in order to obtain a marketing consent. You may also notice that I'm mentioning email in the consent text. Scenario 2, now Atcore is still operating in one country, but we have expanded our portfolio of marketing channels to also include text messages or SMS and social media. So yes, I'm still only operating in Denmark. However, I'm using more channels. And as you can see, I have also included these additional channels in the text. Scenario 3, now I'm using one marketing channel, but I am operating in multiple countries, excuse me. And as I'm operating in multiple countries, I need to ensure that the consent text is aligned with the local legal legislations, as well as being phrased in the local language. So in this example, I have Danish, which I have written in English, just so you're able to read it, Spanish, and French. And finally, we have the fourth scenario. So now we are operating in multiple countries, and we are also using multiple marketing channels. This is the most complex scenario, as I need to ensure alignment with local legal legislations. More specifically, we are distinguishing between something we call implicit or explicit marketing channels. So an implicit marketing channel means that the given channel does not have to be mentioned in the consent text, whereas the explicit marketing channel means that the given channel has to be mentioned in the consent text. And what we have found working with our clients is that the channels that need to be explicitly mentioned, so the channels that are considered explicit marketing channels, vary a lot from country to country. So this is strictly an example, what I'm showing right now. But you can see in Denmark, email, text messages, and social media are explicit. They have to be mentioned in the text. Spain, only email is mentioned, which means that social media and text messages are implicit marketing channels in Spain. And in France, email and text messages are mentioned, which means that social media messaging is implicit. So this might be a made-up example, but it actually reflects the complexity in reality and the different approaches that countries may have towards determining whether a marketing channel is explicit or implicit. And to make matters a bit more complicated, we always recommend that you show the updated marketing consent text in the correct language. So if a Danish person visits the Danish website, you should show the Danish legal text in Danish. But if a Danish person visits a Spanish website, you should show the Danish legal text in Spanish. And just a third example, if a Spanish person visits a French website, the person should see the Spanish legal text in French. I will get back to this later in the webinar when I talk about the blueprint. Just summing up what I talked about in terms of how complex consent management can be. So I described for you the 4 scenarios, and I've also introduced you to implicit channels and explicit channels and how countries have a different approach towards them. Now, I just want to highlight the importance of taking your time to understand local legal legislations. Every country is basically a legal entity to be considered. And you might think, why not just include all channels in the consent text across all countries? And I won't exclude this as an option because it will simplify your consent management. However, if it's not legally required to explicitly mention a specific channel in the consent text, I would recommend that you exclude it from the text. And this is because we work from the assumption that the more terms people need to agree to in the consent text, the less likely they are to give their consent. So this is why we make an effort to minimize the number of channels mentioned in the consent text. All right, that was a little bit about the complexities around consent management. And next, I would like to give you some ideas on how to approach the collaboration with your legal department. I have divided the preliminary legal process into 4 steps. So first of all, you need to make a channel and geographic overview. Next, you need to initiate legal dialogues. After the legal dialogues, you are able to build what we call a country channel grid. And lastly, you can identify and map consent groups. So first of all, making a marketing channel and geographic overview, you need to ask or need to answer 2 fairly simple questions. So what marketing channels does your company use, and which countries does your company operate within? That will allow you to build this specific overview. So on the vertical, we have the countries, and on the horizontal, we have the marketing channels. And it's based off this specific overview that you can initiate your legal dialogues. Because for every single legal entity or country or region you are operating in, you need to ask 2 questions. So you need to ask them which of our channels are explicit and which of our channels are implicit. So which of our channels needs to explicitly be mentioned in the text, in the consent text, and which of our channels are implied by the consent text, so it doesn't necessarily have to be mentioned. After you've had the legal dialogue, you're ready to fill out your country channel grid. And the difference between the overview and the grid is not much, except for that I have inserted X's, as you can see here. An X means that the specific channel must be explicitly mentioned in the consent text. Or, in other words, it's an explicit channel for the given country. So if we look at Denmark, for instance, we can see from this channel grid that email, text message, and social media direct messages needs to be explicitly mentioned in the consent text, whereas outbound calls are implied, so it's an implicit channel, and it doesn't have to be included in the consent text. So if a person fills out, let's say, a form and give their marketing consent, we are allowed to contact them on email, text message, social media, direct messaging, and also outbound calls, even though we are only mentioning email, text message, and social media. I just want to stress once more, this is just an example, so please don't take this for granted and have a dialogue of your own with your legal departments. Lastly, once you have made the country channel grid, you can group your regions or your countries based on their consent approach. So in this example, I have grouped Denmark and Spain in group 1 because they have an identical approach to which channels are explicit and which channels are implicit. And the reason why we are grouping them is simply because once we are moving over to the blueprint and we are setting up our consent management, it makes it a lot easier simply because you can clone the setup from one country to another as long as they have identical approaches to the marketing channels. All right. Next, I'd like to talk about how to design your blueprint. And we have divided that into 3 steps. So first of all, describe which fields you're going to use in your blueprint or in your consent management setup. Then describe how to manage consent texts. And lastly, define the automation rules you need for this to work. Before I start talking about the fields, I just want to show you when I say blueprint, what I'm actually referring to. So a blueprint is, when I say blueprint, this is a description of what we intend to build in our automation platform. So this is a very simplified blueprint, but it describes what needs to happen if a person fills out a form, or for example, if a person is created in and synced from CRM. So once either those two things happen, we check the person's country, and then we have some country-specific automation rules in place that sets the specific channels to true or false and set the dates for the specific channel, and also set the source and campaign for the specific channel. So this is just an overview of what I want to happen in my automation platform. Of course, as I mentioned, this is very simplified, and your blueprint should contain much more details around the automation rules and what needs to happen. But that's very platform specific, and that's why I haven't made it more detailed than what it is right now. All right, so the first step is to describe the fields. What we recommend and the way we work with our clients is that we use 4 fields for each channel. So right now, I have only taken email marketing as an example, but you could have 7 channels or 3 channels, text messaging, social media messages, or outbound calls. But the first field, email marketing, is basically showing if a person have given consent for us to this specific channel. So you can consider it true, false for now. Then the date, when did the person give their consent? And then category and campaign, which is not so much a legal requirement, but more for attribution. So you can evaluate your marketing activities and see which activities have driven the most consent or subscribers or whatever you want to call it. Now, there's a little catch to this string field, so the true false field, because we recommend not just keeping it true false, but actually making the field able to have 4 different values. So the first 2 values, 0, 1, 0, 2, are the true. So either the consent is explicitly obtained or the consent is implied. And then the 3 and 4 are the false values. So either the consent was never obtained or the consent was withdrawn at a certain point. And I just want to show you what it would look like in the database if a person gave their consent. So in this example, and looking back at the country channel grid I made before, we know that a Danish person, or the legislations in Denmark, says that email, text message, and social media direct messaging are explicit channels, and outbound calls is an implicit channel. So if a person from Denmark fills out the form, we can see that, which I've highlighted, that email marketing, text messages, and social media direct messaging has the 0.1 consent explicitly obtained value, whereas outbound calls, being an implicit channel, has an value saying consent implied by local legislations, not explicitly obtained. And the reason why we want to be able to distinguish between 0.1 and 0.2 is to signal, let's say, for instance, if a salesperson is looking in your CRM and want to call some leads, we want to send a signal to this specific salesperson that the lead he wants to call has not given an explicit consent to outbound calls. And to give you an example, in Denmark, based on the work we have done with our clients, we can see that outbound calls is an implied channel, meaning that you are allowed to call people even though they haven't explicitly given their permission to do so in a B2B context. But then again, we also have something called the Robinson list, which is something people can submit to, and that excludes them from being called. So if a salesperson sees on the lead he wants to call that it says consent implied by local legislations, then he knows, or she knows, I'm allowed to call this person legally, but maybe I should show precaution because I haven't explicitly gotten the permission to do so. So there might be some other factors I need to check. For instance, the Robinson list in Denmark. And the Robinson list in Denmark is just one example of many of these exclusion lists that exists across countries. So that's why we want to distinguish between explicit or implicit consent. All right. Apart from the channel-specific fields, we also recommend using some general fields. We have the marketing consent field, which is a regular true or false. So the marketing consent field would be true as long as the specific lead has 01 or 02, so a permission in just one of the channels. Then we also recommend using the consent text field, so store the actual consent text that people consented to. Then a consent changelog that has a historical overview of the consent, and a consent overview, which can be used to give salespeople, for instance, in CRM, a nice overview of what they are allowed to do with this specific lead. And I have shown you a little example of what that could look like. So we have our 4 channels, and then we have an overall marketing consent field, and it's all set to true here in this example. So the specific salesperson would know that this lead, the salesperson would be able to contact them in any channel. And just a quick example of what it would look like if a person from Denmark fills out a form and accepts the marketing consent. So the marketing consent field would be true. The consent text would obviously store the text that they consented to. The changelog would have a lot of information of what just happened. I haven't included that, but it's basically a historical overview of what changes has happened in the consent for the specific lead. And then, of course, the consent overview, which I showed you just now with all the values being true. Now, the next part of designing the blueprint is describing how to manage consent text. Because if you are operating in multiple countries, you're going to have a lot of consent texts. In this example I showed earlier, we were operating in 3 countries, so Denmark, Spain, and France. But operating in just 3 countries would mean that we would need 9 different consent texts. Because as I mentioned, we want to be able to always show the consent text in the correct language. So we need to be able to show the Danish consent text in both Danish, Spanish, and French, because we have a website that has a Danish domain, a Spanish domain, and a French domain. Then we also need to be able to display the Spanish legal text in Spanish, Danish, and French, and the same thing for French. And just having 3 countries or operating in 3 countries, it leaves you with 9 consent texts. If you operate in 4 countries, you would have 16 consent texts. If you operate in 5 countries, you would have 25 consent texts. So you get the picture. You would probably, if you are in an international company, you would probably end up with a lot of consent texts. And yes, we have clients that have hundreds of consent texts. So this is why it's important to describe how you're going to manage and maintain all of these consent texts that you're going to be working with. I just want to say, it's not a legal requirement to show the consent text in the local language. I believe it's in lack of a better word, a public service. Because if, for instance, a Spanish person visits the Danish website and the consent text is in English, we can't just assume that this person from Spain understands English, meaning that we are actually showing some legal text in a language that the person doesn't understand. So that's why I think it's a good idea to keep the legal text localized and translated. And also from a look and feel perspective, so here we have a beautiful Spanish form, and everything is in Spanish. The button is in Spanish, the GDPR text in the button is in Spanish, but the consent text is in English. Just doesn't look nice. So what we recommend doing if you end up with a lot of consent text is that you build something we call a consent text management hub. It sounds very fancy. It doesn't necessarily have to be. It could be a Google Sheet. But basically, you build a hub for consent texts where you can store them and maintain them and fetch them. So we recommend setting up a piece of JavaScript that requests through an API the specific consent text that you need, depending on what country domain of the website the person is on and what country they're from. But I'll describe that in a little more detail here. So in this example, we have a person filling out a form, selecting Spain in country. And once Spain is selected in the country, that sends a signal to the JavaScript to request the Spanish translated consent text from our consent text hub and insert it here. So before people choose a country, the consent text is actually blank. And once they've chosen the country, our script can fetch the right text and insert it in the form like that. And after you have described how to manage your consent texts, you can include that in your blueprint. And then you have by now a pretty good description of what you intend to build, because you have went through which fields you're going to use. You have an overview of the automation rules, what needs to happen when a person fills out a form based on the explicit and implicit channels that you have asked the legal departments in each country about. And from here, you're actually ready to start building it inside your automation platform. So I just want to sum up what I've been going through. So first of all, I established the difference between marketing consent and GDPR consent. Then I gave you an introduction to the complexity in consent management. Then I gave you some ideas on how to approach the legal process. And I gave you some inspiration on how to design your blueprint. And that's what I had for you on consent management. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I would. Hi, my name is Pavel. So I have one question regarding obtaining the GDPR consent versus obtaining marketing consent. So in the form you showed, the one, let's say the one in Spanish, the marketing consent would be the checkbox, and the GDPR would be this text below that they agree and accept the privacy policy of Atcore. So that would be the GDPR, I guess, right?
Exactly.
Okay. And do you think, is it better to have it also as a checkbox, or is it better to have it as a text?
That's a great question. And that's very much up to legal interpretation, especially in GDPR. There are some, I wouldn't necessarily call it gray areas, but there are areas in the GDPR that's up to interpretation on a company level. Some of our clients are fine legally with having the GDPR consent text as you see here on the screen.
Yeah.
And some clients insist on having a checkbox. It all depends on your legal department. So I've shown you the way most of our clients work, but
okay.
For your own sake, ask your legal department what they would suggest.
Sure. Sounds good. And I had another question, but I think you answered it through in presentation. I was wondering how we decide that the person is from the given country, but you showed that once they choose the country, they see the correct language version of the consent, right?
Exactly. And we know based on the URL. So if they are on the Spanish side, we can see that in the URL. So we know they need to see it in the Spanish language. But once they choose their country, we know which legal text, because even though you are if I, as a person from Denmark, visits the Spanish website, I am still under legal jurisdiction of Denmark. So I need to see the Danish legal text, but I need to see it in Spanish. So we know either way, if a person visits the Spanish website, they need to see the Spanish translation. However, which legal text they need to see a Spanish translation of depends on the country they select.
Okay, so if I were, let's say I'm Polish, so if I were to go to the site, Spanish site, I will see it in Spanish, but if I choose Poland, I will see the Polish text, like the text for, like, I mean the Polish law, the Polish consent policy.
Yeah. Exactly, yes, but translated to Spanish to keep it aligned with the rest of the page.
Great. So that would be all from my side. Thank you very much.
All right, sure.
Great
Thanks
presentation.
For the questions. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Silence. Okay. Thank you so much for joining. And if you have any further questions, you can reach out to me on my email, mdu@atcore.dk. So thanks again for joining and have a lovely day.
You too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.